Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to M11, our Cultural Competency Project. I'm your presenter, Ryan De La Rosa, and today we'll be going over professional development strategies in regards to cultural awareness in our classrooms. To state the question plainly, how does cultural identity impact students' motivation, self-esteem, and overall well-being in the learning environment? Now, as educators, we often tend to feel that our jobs end at teaching students what they need to know. However, that task is only completed if students feel a connection to their learning environments. We are simply asking, what role does cultural identity play in making sure students progress naturally? Now, why is cultural identity so important? So, how can we expect students to engage in a classroom if they don't know who they are? Students want to feel engaged and a part of the community that they're in. If they don't have that supportive community to kind of back up their own principles, they're not necessarily going to engage in the classroom as well as other students. Cultural identity has often been tied to higher mental health awareness. And mental health awareness also affects things like drug abuse, literacy rates, as well as graduation rates. Now, this is the end-all, be-all goal for students to graduate. So we need to put a higher stress on cultural identity in order for students to be able to have those necessary coping skills that have them deal with their learning environments. What I really want to stress in this chapter is the fact that many behavioral issues that students and teachers deal with alike stem from these cultural barriers. Students who don't know who they are will try to find a group that gives them security in an otherwise alien world. As we see in one of the readings, students tend to feel strong feelings of insecurity. In order to fight these insecurities, they may dress or speak a certain way. Now, this assimilation of sort is a part of that internal discomfort that is exacerbated when students are caught between two cultural systems. This leads us to our first focus. So today our focus is going to be on the Native American boarding schools. Now, the Native American boarding schools were essentially a dark chapter of American history, where Native Americans were brashly taken from their families and forced into these boarding schools to kind of fit into the policy of assimilation. Now, assimilation was broken down into three phases. The first phase in erasing their cultural identity was in, of course, their appearance. So Native Americans were stripped of their hair rights, whereas their hair represents a deep cultural and spiritual part of themselves. It would be cut and given more Western haircuts. Secondly, their garments. So whereas their garments are an expression of their tribe or which area of the continental United States they come from, they were all given the same clothing, and they were all given military garments. And thirdly, their language was essentially erased for many of these tribes. So whereas their dialect would be special to whatever clan or tribe they would come from, all students were instructed in English, and they would be punished if they spoke their native tongue. Now, to leeway into our next point in regards to language, what might be some of the steps or strategies that we can implement into our classrooms? Typically, across the rest of the world, students tend to go through dual language classrooms where they end up speaking multiple languages fluently. In the US, for whatever reason, institutions tend to stray away from dual language classrooms. Now, how can we deal with this fact as institutional transitions take place? One of the baby steps that I really liked was the use of bilingual books to kind of garner that exchange of culture first. And secondly, I think just labeling things around the classroom so that both groups or whatever groups may be in that classroom can at least have a common understanding of what things are called in both English and whatever native tongue that student might speak. As stated in the text, valuing students' native language supports them in developing positive attitudes towards school and learning. Another strategy that supports students in acquiring English while valuing their home languages is the construction of a classroom bilingual, trilingual dictionary to which students contribute words in their home languages. I would really like to emphasize that last part, where it states that it is estimated that 50% of today's spoken languages will be extinct or seriously endangered in this century. Keeping these languages alive shows students who continually struggle with literacy and graduation rates that we are cognizant of their issues. Now, what are some of the step-by-step strategies that we can implement in our classrooms? The first step is to, one, identify the languages represented in the classroom. Once identified, you must determine the language level and comprehension of those students. Secondly, like we said in the last slide, providing instances for verbalization of words in common projects. Text written in both languages, explanations for jargon. Again, this emphasis on cultural awareness. I think jargon is really important to cover, as many students aren't necessarily familiar with those colloquial phrases that us as Americans or people from other countries implement in their speech. And of course, translating when necessary and really taking the time to break down complex concepts. I know what I've done in the past with some of my students is that I like to give them privacy in groups so that they can read aloud and really garner that English comprehension that is crucial for them in their lives. I think giving them that space for them to make mistakes and twist their tongue, I feel this is how students grow, and sometimes being in classrooms makes it difficult for students to engage in mistake making for fear of embarrassment or teasing, how most kids are often in classrooms. I think one of the less talked about topics is cultural involvement in extracurricular activities. As educators, we often tend to forget that activities after school can serve as a way to bridge that gap between parent involvement in our schools. These after school activities can also serve as team building activities, getting students used to working with others to serve a common goal or purpose, embracing cultural identity in things like concerts or dances. And lastly, these activities can help bring awareness to teachers or colleagues who have never been immersed in these rituals or traditions. Again, emphasizing cultural expression for a student population that often at times feels unheard. Now, lastly, I would like to use the example of Ms. Torres. Now, Ms. Torres is bilingual in English and Spanish and has had trouble seamlessly integrating newly arrived Spanish-speaking students into her English-centered classroom. What are some of the ways Ms. Torres can make this transition easier, both for those newly arrived students and those students that have been with Ms. Torres all year long? Right off the bat, Ms. Torres can start by labeling everyday things across the classroom so that students are not confounded when asked to do or get something. Secondly, taking a new look at the literature or worksheets provided can help make the transition easier. How can she expect those students to answer a prompt if they can't necessarily read or comprehend what is expected of them? Establishing a group or room where students can break off to work on reading and solving problems together. Again, giving them space to make mistakes comfortably. This can look like breaking off into groups or even giving them a corner in the room where they can work independently. Some of the literature implemented can expose students to bits and pieces of their culture to other students, garnering that exchange of cultures necessary for understanding. Ms. Torres can also keep an eye out for extracurricular activities that students may be familiar with, posting a flyer in both English and Spanish so that all students can be familiarized with whatever group activity may be taking place. Ms. Torres needs to be cognizant of avoiding any stereotypes in both reaching out to kids and in regards to extracurricular activities. This is very important to remember, as sometimes students can feel pressured into activities that they don't necessarily want to participate in. And that's perfectly normal, as kids are free to take part in whatever activity it is that they like.
And that concludes our professional development. Now, we covered the importance of cultural identity in regards to student behavior and outcomes, bilingual strategies to implement, extracurricular involvement, and Mrs. Torres' triumph in the classroom. Thank you very much, class.